2 weeks ago, I was on Iranian television, and I said, in America, we burn books, we do not burn people. Now, in America, most people would get the point of that statement. Most people would immediately shudder with the idea of burning another human being rather than burning another book, or rather than just burning one of millions of books printed every single year on nothing but mulched wood paper. Well, guess how the Iranian audience and the audience the Iranians had gathered in Washington and London for this particular show seemed to feel. The idea of burning the book was bad. The idea of burning the person did not horrify them. The idea of burning the book horrified them. Very different kinds of people in this world, TJ, and we fail to recognize it.
Why don't you talk a little bit about how that Iranian TV appearance came to be?
It came to be because about 4 years ago, an Iranian television outlet that I'd never heard of called Press TV began to call and ask if I would go on their shows. And at first I was absolutely no way, because when I checked it out, Press TV, it turned out, was owned by the Iranian government. And Press TV was the equivalent of the BBC World Service for the Iranian government. It was their totally global English language television channel. It was their basic propaganda outlet, and they wanted to make it look as Western as possible so that when they tried to put the poison pill of strange ideas, very, very destructive ideas, down your throat, they coated it in candy. And they wanted to coat it in candy with people like me who would make them look legitimate. Not that I'm much of anything, but I am a Zionist, atheist Jew, which makes me a target and absolutely the demon 3 times over. Atheists are demons, Jews are demons, and whatever the hell else I am is a demon too. So that was it. Well, I wouldn't go on because I didn't want to help them validate their absolutely appalling ideas, assuming they have absolutely appalling ideas. And then, but eventually I decided to go on. Better to have some voice than no voice. Better to have somebody speaking on behalf of a different perception of reality than theirs than nobody speaking on behalf of a different perception of reality from theirs. And the first 4 times I appeared on Press TV were perfectly fine. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, the audience. Yes, the guests were stacked against me. The audiences were stacked against me. But that wasn't terribly bad. But this 5th appearance was frightening in ways that I have a hard time expressing. And it was frightening because, okay, there's a long story. Are you ready for a long story?
I am. I'm going to strap myself in right now.
They sent me a rather peculiar letter. It was actually very polite in its own way. They normally don't give me any kind of notice about who I'm going to be going on with and what and any of the details of their approach to the subject. They just let me know what the subject is, and that's it. And it's very embarrassing. None of all of us humans pretend we can remember names, and none of us can remember names. I can't even remember my own name. That's why I keep it on my shirt. And it's very disturbing. You've seen these people on PBS and various other shows and CNN who don't know who the other person is that's on camera at the same time from a different city, and who, because they blank on the name, go, as your previous guest said. Well, you know what that means. He's forgotten the fucking name! So I don't want to go through that embarrassment, and I've been asking them to give me the names of the people on the shows with me, and they have been failing to do that. But this time they did it, which was very polite. But they also gave me a hint about what the slant would be of the show, and the slant was a little peculiar. For example, well, we'll give you a sense in a second. The setup of the show is this. They have audiences in London, Washington, and Tehran. They have experts in Tehran, London, and New York. So it's us 3 experts and 3 audiences. And 75% of the show is statements from the audience. So these can seem like they're genuine, unrehearsed statements from the general public. And only 25% is statements from us alleged experts. And they begin the show by asking for an opinion on the Quran burnings from one of the innocently planted bystanders who hasn't been coached at all about what to say in the audience. And this person, and I can't remember which city he's in, opens his mouth and says, look, we Christians and we Muslims have been getting along famously for 1,300 years now. And the only thing that has ever separated us are some unnamed group of troublemakers. And my suspicion, in essence, he says, is that this unnamed group of troublemakers is behind the burnings of the Koran. Okay, now let us think about this for a second, TJ. The Christians and the Arabs have been getting along, or the Muslims have been getting along famously for 1,300 years, right? Like you Christians really, really wanted the Muslims to take over the entire Christianized Roman Empire, right? I mean, you really, really wanted to invite them into the city where St. Paul was blown off his ass by seeing a ball of light in the sky and converted to Christianity, Damascus, right? You really, really wanted to give them the country that gave birth to Coptic Christianity and to the entire monastic movement, where Saint Simeon Stylites built himself a pyramid. He built himself actually a tower about 60 feet high and sat on it for 30 years in order to demonstrate how devoted he was to Christianity or Islam. I give you your choice. Actually, to Christianity. And you really wanted them to have that territory, didn't you? You wanted them to have Hippo in northern Africa, in what is now called Libya, where a guy named St. Augustine lived and wrote. Right? We could go on and on. You wanted them to have Spain for 700 years. Weren't you enthusiastic about that, TJ? Don't you remember that?
I do remember that.
Oh, those wonderful, wonderful days when the Christians and the Muslims got along famously. When, if any Christian entered the Muslim world, he could anticipate being dead within his first 15 moments of being discovered as a Christian. I mean, as late as the 19th century, adventurers disguised themselves as Arabs and taught themselves Arabic, and wore Arabic clothes in the attempt that to become among the first Christians ever to enter and exit alive from Islamic lands. It was a big deal. You liked that, didn't you? Weren't we Christians really, really joyous about that? But it didn't demonstrate that Muslims were treating you just ducky, complete with duck sauce. And yes, remember those good old days? Remember those good old days when the Turkish Empire, the Muslim empire of the time, used to steal Christian kids in the Balkans and take them off to Istanbul and raise them as Muslims. And when they reached the age of 10, if some of those children objected to being Muslims and wanted to be Christians, it was the end of their earthly life. Do you remember those wonderful days? And then turned them into military men, turned them into the bravest warriors of all, into the Janissaries of the Roman Empire. Surely you remember those wonderful days. It was all treats and ice cream. Basically, this guy gets up in the audience and he says, we Christians and we Muslims have gotten along famously for 1,300 years now, and it's just some little group of rabble-rousing troublemakers who've ever managed to split us. And those people are undoubtedly the people behind the Koran burning. Now, who could these rabble-rousers possibly be? I wonder. Well, is there a clue in the way that the Iranians, the name the Iranians gave to Terry Jones down in Florida, who talked about burning a Koran? First of all, I found the idea of burning a Koran absolutely loathsome until you did it, and you turned it into comedy. But the way Terry Jones wanted to do it, I found it genuinely offensive. And just because you don't want religion, and I don't want religion, and Richard Dawkins doesn't want religion, and the 250,000 people who subscribe to the amazing atheists don't want religion, doesn't mean that for those people to whom in the world religion is wonderful, it is a chocolate sundae with extra whipped cream, it doesn't mean we should be denying it to them. I mean, sometimes it's very good for you. So the idea that one group would deliberately upset another group over their religion and give a sign of utter, complete contempt for that religion is a little disturbing to me. However, I also found something a little weird about the two-word phrase with which Iranian TV summarized the identity of the guy, the Baptist minister in Florida who wanted to burn the Koran, Terry Jones. Guess what it called him? And see if this gives you any clues as to who that unnamed people could be who have been mischievously and maliciously and villainously tearing Muslims away from Christians, despite the fact that they love each other like brothers or like lovers. Okay, are you ready for the
I'm
two-word
ready.
phrase that
I'm ready
describes
for it.
Terry Jones, the Zionist priest? Any clues there, TJ? Anything anywhere that
No,
might give you a hint?
that seems totally kosher to me.
Yes, right. Well, okay. And then for the rest of the show, we went on in this vein until an Iranian filmmaker, and this is quite a filmmaker. He's made a whole bunch of feature films. He made a film on the Iran-Iraq War. He made a film about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And his most recent film is called The Messiah. And it's about Jesus. That just shows you how ecumenical he is, right? And he said, we all know, all over the world, and 97% of Americans know, that this business that Muslims caused 9/11 is false. We all know this. We all know that somebody else was behind 9/11. And of course, he left it to your imagination to figure out who that someone else might be, too. Now, if you regularly watch Coast to Coast, the radio show on which I've appeared 50 times, I was about to say 50,000. It's not true. It's only 50. But much as I regret it, I would have liked the other 49,000 how many other times. But the fact is that on that show, they will tell you that the CIA and the Mossad did it. Now, who are the Mossad? Could they have anything to do with one of the words in that phrase for the Zionist priest? Like Jewish? No, no, absolutely not. No, we never said that, said Iranian TV, in essence. So Iranian TV basically was setting up a framework of reference that harked back to one of my first experiences with Islam back in 1962. In 1962, I was a stowaway at Swarthmore College. A stowaway meant I was living on campus in the dormitories for 30 days, and I was using their library where non-students were not allowed, and I was picking up my food at their cafeteria, which of course I hadn't paid for. So I admit that's a slight moral hazard or something like that. And but I was 19 years old, for God's sakes. I didn't have any money. And I was studying like mad every day in their library, and I was studying up for a trip to the Middle East. And I read all about the Nabateans who had built the first irrigation platforms and very sophisticated ones in the Negev desert and all kinds of things that would be of use to me in this trip to the Middle East. And then one day I ran across something I didn't know libraries had, which is, instead of just books, file cabinets. And in the file cabinets were pamphlets. And in the folders of pamphlets, there was a pamphlet from an official body in the Middle East. It was an official body named something like the United Arab League. It was an official body that was backed and supported by Egypt and Syria and Saudi Arabia and a bunch of other really heavy-duty countries. And this very official booklet told me something I had never known about World War II. Now, see if you've heard this before, because it's the untold truth about World War II. It seems there's a small group of people who are really behind all of our world wars. You see, they own all the banks, and they own all the media outlets. They own all the newspapers. And what do they use their banks and newspapers to do? Well, periodically they use it to crash the economy. And what did they do in approximately 1938 and 1939? Well, you see, there was somebody named Adolf Hitler, but you don't know the real truth about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, according to this pamphlet from the United Arab League, was a Jewish puppet. Did you know that, TJ?
I did not know that.
He was danced around by the Jews. He was created by the Jews.
I'm ashamed that I wasn't aware of that, but I was.
Yes, I'm sorry. Your ignorance, TJ. Oh my God, yes.
Major lapse in my academic knowledge there.
Yes, so he was a Jewish puppet, and with his help, the Jews pulled off a charade that never really happened, but did. Now, it never really happened because the Jews are lying when they say it happened, but it did because Adolf Hitler made it happen because the Jews made Adolf Hitler do it, right? So there's a slight discrepancy between the fact that it did and didn't happen is not our fault. After all, we're United Arab League. We have God on our side. We can get away with saying anything. At any rate, the point is that this big charade, this massive hoax, was called the Holocaust. And the Jews created Adolf Hitler, and they gave him his lines, and they danced him around like a marionette in order to get the world's sympathy. So the world would give them a swatch of territory called Israel. Now let's think about this for a second. Palestine. Palestine was a territory named by the Romans. It never had any indigenous Islamic identity. Never. So far as I know, anyway, and I don't know everything, but I've studied this for 50 years now. And when it was divided up, 70% of it was given to Islamic folks who lived in the neighborhood. So I think we'd have to call them Palestinians. And they were given a king over them by us horrible Westerners, and that's not fair for us to give them a king, but we did it. And we let them call this 70% of Palestine Jordan. Okay, that got rid of 70%. And then the rest, the 30%, was sort of sliced in half, and half of it was given to the Jews who've been thrown out by the imperialists a total of approximately 4 times and keep trying to get back there, including by imperialist Islam. And one way or the other, no matter how you slice it, the Jews danced Adolf Hitler around like a puppet and created him from nothing in order to get the world's sympathy so they could get Israel. Now, look, my family, in addition to coming from the Middle East, at least anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, depending on which time the Jews were kicked out by imperialists, my whatever they were, my ancestors were kicked out. In addition to all of that, had spent the rest of their time in Europe. Now, I had a big family in Europe, and a little family in the United States. The really mother family was over in Europe. But I was born in 1943, the year of the non-existent Holocaust. So guess what happened to my family over in Europe? It doesn't exist. Now, either my grandparents materialized from nothing, from thin air,
Yeah.
or I lost hundreds and hundreds of family members in a non-existent event called the Holocaust.
Or maybe they just went underground into their secret bunker where they have all the world's gold
bunker,
hidden. And...
Right, where they plan the next big bank collapse and where they control the newspapers and all of that kind of stuff. Meantime, I do have a couple of relatives. There was one of my aunt's mothers, never ever talked to me about this, but she was the only member of her family to survive the Holocaust. Her sisters, her brothers, her father, her mother, her cousins, they are all gone. Could you legitimately walk up to my aunt and say the Holocaust never happened? She'd have punched your fucking eyes out if she were that kind of a person. She wasn't that kind of person, but that would have been a right of hers because she lost her family in the most brutal way possible. I have another cousin who was raised by a Catholic family on a farm. And she was raised by a Catholic family on a farm because her parents were afraid that they couldn't guarantee her survival. And they gave her to this family in the hope that that family would allow her to live. And that family did indeed allow her to live, and she's alive today. But what about her brothers? What about her sisters? What about her parents? What about her cousins? What about her aunts and uncles? They are all gone. There was a Holocaust. It destroyed my entire family. The idea that there never was a Holocaust and that it's a giant hoax is a fucking goddamned lie. The idea that Hitler was a Jewish puppet is one of the most outrageous statements ever made in the history of the world. But if you make an outrageous statement long enough, and if you make it hard enough, and you put enough money behind it, eventually you can get people to believe it. So in 1962, there was a pamphlet, and it said the Jews caused World War II. And they did it in order to get the sympathy of the world, in order to get approximately 25% of the territory of Palestine. And that horrified me. It absolutely horrified me. Now, it doesn't have to horrify you if you're not Jewish, because what does it matter what you believe? It doesn't matter. But it matters to people like me because, I don't like being a target. And the real question is, has the Islamic world, at least that part of the Islamic world that wants to promote this crazy, absolutely outrageous notion, has it made any progress since 1962? And the answer was right there in front of my eyes when I was doing Iranian TV. Because the audience in Washington, the audience in London, and the audience in Tehran all agreed that basically us Christians and us Muslims have always gotten along. It's only been a little problem that's gotten in our way. This little group of rabble-rousing, troublemaking people. Now, which means we have, and we're not going to name the people, but we seem to have a problem with them. Well, if you've got a Jewish problem, which is what Hitler said was the problem with the world, he said the Jews were causing all of the economic crashes, owned all of the newspapers, owned all of the banks, were controlling the world. He said this back in 1936, from 1933 when he ascended to power on, and he'd been saying it before then, and he got enough people to believe in him to use this as an excuse to wipe out 6 million Jews. It's being mounted again. The same kind of lie is being mounted again. And it's making a difference. It's making a dent, and it's making a sufficient dent that people in London and Washington and Tehran, sophisticated people, well-educated people, people who have their hands on fact after fact after fact of the real history of the world, and who are able to use all kinds of slick, sophisticated intellectual phrases, that these people, despite all their intellectual qualities, believe it. And that is scary. To me, that was scary as hell. Among other things, it was scary as hell. Now, look, this is remarkably parochial, and it's the kind of thing that turns most people off. Why should anybody care about Jews? I mean, why should anybody care about Italian Americans? I mean, why should anybody care about about Armenians? Well, actually, there are lots of reasons to care about these people now that I think about it. But at any rate, why should anybody care about the interests of one tiny little group of people? Well, it is a tiny little group of people. There are a total of 13 million Jews in the world. Do you know how small that is? That is less than the population of just one out of the 200 major Islamic cities in the world. Just one. Less than the population of just one of 200 major Islamic cities in the world. Every once in a while, I sit down to do the math on how 13 million people total compare with 1.8 billion, which is what Muslims claim for themselves these days, 1.8 billion people, and the figures, I can never keep the figures in mind. I'm terrible with zeros. But one group overwhelmingly outclasses the other group. It's like putting Jews against Muslims is like putting the population of Scarsdale up against all of China. If Scarsdale were to make war on China, who would win? On the other hand, if China were to discover that it's politically advantageous to get its people whipped up about going to war with Scarsdale, who would win?
Yeah.
It's all automatic. China would win. Scarsdale would lose. Well, the Jewish population of the world is somewhere approximately the same as Scarsdale, and the Muslim population of the world is much larger than the population of China. And yet, the Muslims are trying to pretend that us Jews, who really have very, very seldom been allowed into the parlors of wealth, we've been despised by the people who control the parlors of wealth. I mean, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants tend to monopolize the wealth in the United States and in the English-speaking world. And I don't, it doesn't bother me, but the fact is that Jews are frowned on in the major centers of power. I mean, how many Jewish members of Skull and Bones have there ever been at Yale? Until the last 50 years, Jews weren't allowed into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, or at least they were allowed in very rarely. At any rate, we're supposed to care about other people, and we're supposed to care about whether they live or die. And I think it's extremely important to care about mass murder. It's not extremely important to care about mass murder after it's happened, because then it's too late. It's extremely important to care about mass murder before it happens. It's extremely important to spot it before it happens. And it's extremely important to try to stop it before it happens. And if you see the tools of mass murder, especially the perceptual tools of mass murder, being brought out and sharpened, it's your job to stop it. Now, because I think I've told you the story, but maybe I haven't, so tell me. I have a brain like a leaky rutabaga. But back in 1981, I was approached by Little Steven from the E Street Band, Bruce Springsteen's band, because I had helped establish the base for Amnesty International in North America. And later I would go on to help establish Farm Aid. And so I was known for causes like that. And little Stephen called up, or it might have been Danny Schechter, a producer from 2020 that he was working with, and said, look, we're planning this anti-apartheid concert in Africa, and we'd like you to do the publicity. Would you do it? And I said, I'll do it, but only on one condition. There's something happening in Africa that's bothered me far, far more than apartheid in South Africa. Despite the fact that apartheid in South Africa, the separation of blacks from whites, and the maintenance of the blacks as a really downtrodden underclass is extremely disturbing. But there's something much more disturbing happening in Central Africa, and it is mass murder in the making. It's an existing mass murder that could skyrocket into a much bigger mass murder. So I will do the anti-apartheid publicity for you for free if you will give me 50% of our joint work time to spend on what was then called black-on-black violence in Central Africa. And because it was politically unfashionable to talk about black-on-black violence, and it was politically fashionable to talk only about apartheid, they turned me down. Well, the two tribes whose violence against each other I wanted to stop in 1981 were called the Hutus and the Tutsis. And the country in which they were making war on each other even then was called Rwanda. And if only Danny Schechter and Little Stephen had not been so lily-assed, so pusillanimous, so utterly devoid of moral comprehension as to not realize the difference between your burning a Koran and somebody burning a human being, which is the difference between the apartheid and black-on-black violence in Central Africa. If only they had woken up, they could have helped save 1 million lives. Because later on in that same decade, 1 million people would die in the battle between Hutus and Tutsis, in the genocides between Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda. So it's our job not to bemoan the genocides after they have happened in order to make ourselves look fashionable, which is what the very same people did with Rwanda after it was too late. They exploited it. They capitalized on it. It is important to stop it before it can happen. And that's true whether the people involved are Hutus and Tutsis, with whom I share no genes except for the normal human genes at all. But I share genes with them because they are humans and I am human too. And it's our job to stop mass murders of our fellow human beings. But now the perceptual weapons that are used to justify mass murders are being turned against me. Now, in reality, the Islamic world has been trying to turn those perceptual weapons against my tribe since at least 1962. But what the Iranian show proved to me, or at least seemed to prove to me, is those perceptual tools are now kicking in and taking hold and getting a grip in sophisticated, intellectual Western circles.
Well, I was just when you were talking about the whole Holocaust denial thing, I've had some run-ins with the Holocaust denial crowds in the past. I haven't actually argued with any Muslim Holocaust deniers. But I'm sure that was probably the genesis of some of the stuff that these people were talking about. In particular, I remember there was someone who was a friend of mine on Facebook a month or two back who, I noticed that increasingly was posting some really strange stuff to their wall on Facebook, and the straw that broke the camel's back for me, after I'd confronted them about it a few times, and they'd insisted that I was being reactionary about it, but when they actually posted this lengthy article about how Auschwitz was actually really nice, and it was basically it was like a nice resort for the Jewish people, I was like, fuck this guy, and
that was how kindly of those Germans.
I know, and that's when I blocked him, and after tearing him to shreds. But I just wanted to know, what is your maybe what do you think about the whole Holocaust denial thing that's like, beyond just the Islamic angle, and why is it caught on with so many people?
Neil Miller and somebody or other Doob were trying to figure out why we had lynchings. And they came up with a kind of wacky idea. And the wacky idea was, well, maybe it's because people are frustrated. And they tried to come up with a measure of frustration. Now, in those days in the South, where all the lynchings were going on, and the people being lynched, of course, were black, an awful lot of people in the South either made their money raising cotton or made their money as middlemen for cotton, somewhere along the long path of cotton to the cotton T-shirt, to fruit of the loom. They made a discovery. When cotton prices were high, there were very few lynchings. When cotton prices went down, the number of lynchings went up. And they came up with something called the frustration-aggression hypothesis. And the general idea was, when you come to expect something, like you come to expect $1.12 for, God knows, a case of cotton, and the price goes down to 72 cents, you get frustrated, you get angry. How do you deal with your anger? You either take it out on yourself and put a bullet in your head, or you take it out on somebody else. And of course, in the South, who did you take it out on? The people at the very bottom of the social totem pole, who happened to be the blacks who were kept at the bottom of the social totem pole so that they would be useful for those purposes whenever those purposes were needed. But then how do you prove that using the tools of laboratory psychology? Well, here's how the Dubin-Miller guys tried to prove it. They ran a rat down a maze. It was a straight line maze like a bowling alley, toward a piece of cheese. And the rats ran down very enthusiastically, especially once they discovered that every time they ran this maze, they'd get a piece of cheese at the end. Then the nasty researchers put a little piece of electrified wire in front of the cage, and the rat ran down expecting his piece of cheese, and all of a sudden, just before he got to the cheese, his feet went... The rat was rather unhappy about this. Well, if you gave him something that looked like another rat, he beat the shit out of something that looked like another. I mean, look, logically, what do you think a rat should do once its feet have been sizzled while it's trying to get a piece of cheese? And it's got another piece of rat. Don't you think you should walk over to the rat and say, well, let's go have a beer together. I had a really hard time today. Could you give me a hug? Shouldn't it ask that other rat for support and company? No! It beat the shit out of the other rat! And you could say, well, those are rats. Us humans wouldn't do that. Let's think about that for a minute, TJ. Okay, then they came up with a different variation on the experiment. They put 7 rats on a hot plate. And they turned the heat up so the little rat's feet would sizzle. And when the pain began to hit, guess what happened to this group of 7 rats? Did they huddle together to give each other company? Did they get together and plot and scheme to figure out ways to get off the hot plate? Did they take advantage of the fact that there are more brains in a group of 7 than there are in just one? Any of that stuff?
No.
On your life. 6 rats managed to quickly feel out who was the weakest rat on the hot plate, and once they all reached an agreement, whammo, guess what they did to the weakest rat? They beat the shit out of him. Bet that made him feel good, eh? So that's what happens. And now, look, for rats, if you put 7 rats who've never met each other before on a hot plate, and you turn up the hot plate over and over again, you do this experiment 100 times, those poor rats, for 100 times, have to figure out who the weakest rat on the hot plate is. And, of course, no rat is going to want to be the weakest rat on the hot plate, so this is going to be a tricky proposition, since any rat that you pick is likely to try to fight back. But if you send the same group of rats to the same hot plate every time, and they pick a member who's the automatic guy to pick on once the heat goes up, think of all the time and energy you're saving everybody. With the exception, of course, of the poor rat who gets picked on.
Yeah, well, you're still saving him time and energy, I think. Yeah,
well, the world has had a standard rat to pick on for 2,000 years. It's called Jews. In Egypt, in Alexandria, Egypt, about 2,000 years ago, it might even have been 2,200 years ago, there were allegedly somewhere around 1 million Jews in this city of about 2 to 3 million people. And the local, they weren't Christians yet, but the local Greeks, because everybody was basically Greek in Alexandria at that point. It was post-Alexander the Great, and it was the period of the Ptolemaic empires, and Ptolemy was a general of Alexander's, and the Alexandrians, the Ptolemies, had been in charge for 300 years. It was a Greek civilization. And the Greeks, whenever there was a difficult time in Alexandria, discovered that they could take it out on the Jews. And then it went international, the same way that a lot of other Alexandrian inventions went international. Other Alexandrian inventions that went international, the library, for example. And it became such an automatic that by the 1970s or 1980s, when there was an anti Semitic book published in Japan, a country that never had any Jews, they don't even know what a Jew looks like. They wouldn't know a Jew if they saw him walking down the street with paste wrapped all over his shoulders, um, like mink stoles. Um, they over 1 million copies of this book sold. Why? Because it's so much easier to have a publicly designated scapegoat that we all can agree on, and you don't have to make up your minds. When Islam was first coming to life, well, poor Muhammad, he had this appalling experience. He went out into the countryside with his wife and decided to meditate in a cave. And there he was meditating in the cave, and all of a sudden it felt like something grabbed him in a bear hug and made it impossible for him to believe. And he had this wild jumble of perceptions and delusions and God knows what, and whatever it is, it scared the shit out of him. And it scared the shit out of him because there were two kinds of people that he absolutely loathed and despised, and he was afraid he was becoming both of them. And those two groups of people were poets and what was the other one? Philosophers or something of the sort, mystics. Well, he didn't want to be either of those things. Poets and lunatics, that's what it was. Poets and lunatics. And he didn't want to be either a poet or a lunatic. And it scared him to death. So his wife grabbed him by the sleeve and dragged him off to a cousin of hers. And her cousin was an expert in Christianity and Judaism, or at least as expert as people were in that part of the world at that time. And her cousin sat down and listened to the whole story and then said, look, don't worry about it. You know, there are these people called the Jews, and they've been expecting that they have prophets, and these prophets come to them periodically, and they talk to them about a Messiah. So you're either one of the prophets or you're one of the Messiahs. Not that there have ever been any Messiahs. It's been a cruel joke, the whole Messiah business, but for Jews anyway. And this was much more satisfactory than believing that he was a lunatic or a poet. So Muhammad got all excited and figured, okay, if I'm a prophet, if I'm the next prophet to the Jews, and if this experience is what this cousin of my wife was telling me, and that it's actually the angel Gabriel coming to announce to me that I'm a prophet, well, if I go to the Jews, they'll welcome me as a prophet. And I'll be in like Flint. I'll be a huge hero. I mean, how often does a prophet come along? Once every 200 years? So he went to the Jews and he told them that he was a prophet, and the Jews are accustomed to this kind of thing. They have people cropping up who are marginally mad, who claim to be prophets all the time, and Jews shrug it off. They, in fact, don't take to it terribly kindly. Don't bother me already. Don't bother me until there's a real prophet. And so the Jews turned a cold shoulder to him, and Muhammad didn't take terribly kindly to this. And then he learned a lesson. He went up against first of all, he fled Mecca because the Medinaites, his fellow Arabs, got tired of him too, and they got tired of him preaching all the time, and they got tired of his preachings appealing to their slaves in particular because this was creating some sort of unrest among the slaves. And they finally decided when they tried to buy him off, they tried to talk him off, they tried to get him to calm down about these bizarre ideas of his already, and he wouldn't shut up. So finally, they allegedly decided to murder him. And he managed to hot-foot it out of town just before the hours before the murder plot was supposed to happen. So he went off 200 miles to a town called Medina. And in Medina, the Medinites actually welcomed him, and they welcomed his peculiar notions. For some reason that has been lost to us, they found his peculiar notions very useful for their own purposes. And then he began to organize groups of the townsmen of Medina who were putting up his followers and himself as house guests. Well, for one thing, he had to repay them as house guests. You know, people are going to throw you out if they're spending money on food for you all the time and they're giving up spare rooms for you, and you never show any way of repaying them the kindness. So Muhammad came up with a handy-dandy way of repaying the kindness. He happened to know that the folks from Mecca made most of their money from camel caravans. How did he know that? His wife was the wealthiest woman in Mecca, and she ran most of the most successful camel caravans while they were still back in Mecca. So he put together a party of raiders, and the raiders went out and raided the Medina or the Meccan caravans. And eventually the Meccans got tired of having a person killed here and there, and all of their loot stolen, and all of their actually honestly made gains stolen, their honest profits, and they decided to go finish off this Muhammad character once and for all. And the first time they showed up to finish Muhammad off, he beat the shit out of them. And he killed many of their most famous men, their most honest and virtuous men, the men to whom everybody owed favors because they'd lived off the generosity of these men for a long time. And then, just to make matters worse, he took the bodies and he dumped them in a well, just to show real contempt. It was the equivalent of throwing them down a shithole. And the Medinites or the Meccans were not terribly happy about this. And when the Meccans showed up he got word that the Meccans were going to show up again in 3 months' time. When the war season started, because you had to work during a certain part of the year in order to have the luxury of war, which was considered an Arab hobby, according to one of the Muslim historians. He got wind of the fact that they were going to show up and they were going to try to exterminate him from the face of the planet. He didn't know what to do. One of his men was a man of Persian extraction, and he said, "Look, we have this strategy in Persia. We dig a trench. We dig it about 15 feet deep. We dig it about 10 feet wide, and then nobody can get at us." So Muhammad led his group in digging a trench, and 3 months later, when the Meccans showed up, they had to stand outside the trench and wait. They had a hope that something would drive Muhammad and his men out of Medina. And nothing came along to drive these guys out of Medina. Meanwhile, the guys inside Medina were starving to death and running out of water, but so were the guys out in the desert on the other side of the trench. And finally, a hurricane came up, and the hurricane was so bad it blew the tents away, and it blew even the cooking pots away. I mean, imagine blowing a cast iron cooking pot that weighs 30 pounds away. That's some hurricane. And the leader of the Meccans got up and kicked his camel and said, "I don't know about you guys, but I'm not staying here anymore." And kicked his camel out of the position it was in, huddled down by the ground, trying to get away from the sandstorm, and rode it back to Mecca. And the rest of the Meccans followed. Well, now here, Muhammad had just had a major victory, right? But if you're living off of the food and the money of your hosts, and you can't produce some nice bounty for them the way you can when you knock off an entire camel caravan, you're in big trouble. Because your hosts are not going to put up with you forever, and your men aren't going to want to hang around with you anymore. Because they're used to getting booty. They're used to getting loot. Plus, all your men and all of the people who are allied with you are used to getting honor. They're used to getting all that chest-swelling stuff that you get when your team beats the pants off of the other team in town, or when your team wins the World Series and some other town loses. He needed to pay people off with all of this stuff, and he couldn't. So when he went back to wash up, he went back to one of his wives' home to wash up, and the angel Gabriel said, "Don't even wash up. Don't even do the afternoon prayers. Get your men together and attack the nearest Jewish village around." So Muhammad got his gang together, and they went to the nearest Jewish village, and they laid siege to it. And when they knocked it off, they did an ethnic cleansing. Originally, Muhammad wanted to exterminate all of the men, and so one of his allies convinced him not to do that because he was fond of these men. He had worked with them for many years. They'd been his allies. And he grabbed Muhammad by the collar and said, "If you kill these men, it's going to be a big problem for you." And Muhammad backed off, and Muhammad sent these people packing, but he kept all of their earthly goods except what they could carry on their camels. And was the first of Muhammad's series of ethnic cleansings and what would later become his annihilations, his mass murders, his genocides. And all of them would be against Jews. Every time he lost a battle, from that point on, Muhammad had a solution. Go to the nearest town of Jews. Do another ethnic cleansing. Or in the case of the third tribe of Jews that he attacked, do an extermination. Kill every man and every boy, every male with pubic hair. And it was through doing this that he established Islam. So Islam has been established on using Jews as scapegoats. It's a very, very old thing. And I have a lot of, or I don't have a lot, but I have a small number of moderate Muslim friends who are pluralist, who are for freedom of speech, who value all the things that you and I value. And and one of them, when I said I wanted to write a book about Muhammad, one of them said, and I asked him what I should read. He sent me to a book by a guy named Muhammad Haikal, who used to be a major mainstream newspaper editor and party member, a politician in Egypt. So you would think this book is recommended to me by a friend who is a moderate Muslim, and it's by a guy who's a mainstream Muslim. And what does it say? Well, it's a huge book. It's about 1,000 pages long, and it's printed up by a printing house in Saudi Arabia that specializes in very central books to Islam, to Islamic education. And it says at the end of one chapter about one of these ethnic cleansings, and Muhammad realized that he would not be able to win the world until he had exterminated all of the Jews. Now that's a paraphrase. I think the word was actually annihilate. But that's the general idea. And if you're Jewish, it's a pretty chilling idea. So I have a friend like your Facebook friend. My friend is named Michael Lockhart. And Michael Lockhart is one of the kindest, gentlest people on the face of the planet. And he's very, very talented. He does flash poetry that's absolutely terrific. I mean, flash as in flash animation.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael has been won over by the kind of person that I was battling against in London when I was on my latest appearance on Iranian television. This guy allegedly is one of the founders and heads of an Islamic research institute. Well, it's not an Islamic research institute. If you read its documentation, it's an Islamic Dawah Institute. Well, what's the difference between an Islamic research institute and an Islamic Dawah Institute? Dawah means conversion. Dawah means going out and proselytizing. Dawah means doing what Mormon kids do when they're 18 or 19 years old. They're sent off all over the world to win converts to Mormonism. It means going out and getting people to believe in Islam. Of course, there's one problem. If you believe in Islam for a month and you decide it's not for you, you have just uttered a death sentence against yourself, because the sentence for leaving Islam once you've entered is death. Clever little mechanism for keeping people in Islam. So at any rate, and Michael has been telling me more and more about how interest is a Judeo-Christian invention. Well, you know, when he says Judeo-Christian invention, the Christian doesn't count. What counts is the Judeo, right? Well, you know, I've just been doing a whole bunch of research, and I've discovered that it's a Babylonian invention, and it goes back to 2500 BC. So where is he getting this idea that it is a Judeo-Christian invention? And Michael believes that his philosophy is pluralism. His philosophy is you should be tolerant toward all kinds of people. But more and more and more, he is saying things that are intolerant toward Jews, and because he is within a social structure that socially validates him, where everybody pats him on the back for saying things that are negative toward Jews but are not negative toward Muslims, he doesn't think he's saying anything that's negative toward Jews. Well, living as a Jew in a little tribe that has been up against attempts after extermination for approximately 2,700 years now, 2,700 years. The Assyrians tried it. All kinds of people tried it. The Romans drove us out of Israel in 157 AD. The Muslims drove us out of Israel in 653 AD and wiped out 40 of our cities. This thing is never ending. When we were transported off to Persia, one of the Persians said to the king, I think there's only one way we can solve the problems in town. It's to kill all the Jews, 70,000 of them, hang them all in one day. I mean, this thing's been going on for a very long time. The Holocaust is not the very first Holocaust in Jewish memory at all. So when a friend begins to accept arguments that say, all the world's problems, they're really caused by the Jews. And I'm really a nice person who's kind to all social groups, and I really believe in multiculturalism, except for those Jews, Except what he doesn't recognize is the exception. He thinks that he's being multiculturalistic and pluralistic and tolerant. And he's being intolerant without knowing it in a frightening way. At least that's the way it looks from my narrow, claustrophobic perspective as a Jew, a Zionist, and an atheist. I mean, one of the things it said, TJ, you'll appreciate this, in the letter that I got from my Iranian TV producer when she was talking, when she was giving me the layout of the show, was basically, well, but we Christians and we Muslims have always understood that it's us against the atheists and the Jews, haven't we? Well, she didn't realize. She was saying this as if, and she didn't say Jews, she just said atheists. So she was saying this, when you and I speak, we expect certain reactions from the people we are speaking to. So for example, when you are burning your Quran and you're saying things that I find incredibly humorous, that you will find a whole bunch of us who find those things humorous. And she is saying, well, we're all against the atheists, aren't we? As if she expects that everybody in the world, because she's so used to everybody in her world, agreeing, oh, that atheist, that's horrible. We should burn them all immediately, shouldn't we? That's the underlying tone. So when she sends it to me, and I, as an atheist, don't think that I should be burnt immediately, she doesn't get it. It would take her a long time to get it. And actually, one of the major lessons I learned from this is we all get embedded in a perceptual structure where we expect everybody around us to agree with us about certain things. And it becomes absolutely unbelievable to us that other people would have radically different systems of belief because we're accustomed to being around people who agree with us on certain basics all of the time. And that's where we run into a big problem because there are certain things like tolerance and freedom of expression where we all agree with everybody else we meet in the street about these things, so we take them for granted, and we assume that these are universal values. They are not universal values. They exist in the United States. They exist to a certain extent in Europe. But they do not exist in Pakistan. They do not exist in Saudi Arabia. They do not exist in Egypt. There are many countries where they do not exist. And if we come to take these things so for granted that we cease to fight for them, they will cease to exist worldwide. And instead of the kinds of points of view that prevail in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt, will prevail all over the world. And there, everything will go that you and I took for granted and thought was of value because we forgot to value them. Now, I don't know if I'm putting this very well, because you don't realize these things until you're up against an experience like this Iranian TV experience, where you suddenly realize that other people do not understand things the way you understand them. In fact, they understand them very differently than you understand them. In the same way that I don't respond to the word atheist the way my producer in Tehran, who's a lovely woman, 32 years old, great fun to work with, aside from the fact that her points of view would lead to my extermination. Aside from that one minor fact. But she doesn't understand that the word atheist isn't a curse word that we cringe at and want to throw stones at all over the world. Well, her belief system is not universal yet, but she's working on it, or her country is working on it, and it's doing a very, very good idea. And it's won over my friend Michael Lockhart, and he doesn't even know it. And all of the things that he believes in, that he thinks are really, really the most positive in life, but he hasn't been able to articulate because he so much takes them for granted, are likely to disappear if he continues to be swept along without any insight into just how rare things like tolerance and pluralism are, and freedom of speech.
How do you think the extremism could be curbed? I mean, how do you deal with a problem like this? I mean, I know that there was a thing in France recently where they did this whole banning the burqa thing, which I'm pretty sure I don't agree with that. I'm
not comfortable with that either.
Yeah,
because
I'm not really. That's a huge.
The burqa may horrify me, but it's not my right to tell a person she can't wear a burqa. And there are people wearing burqas in my neighborhood. When I go to my doctor, my new doctor is Islamic, so I see women with head scarves in there all the time. No, I don't agree with that either, and because I agree with Voltaire. By the way, Voltaire was slammed viciously by the guy in the English studio on Iranian TV, who's allegedly the head of this very, very intellectual Islamic Research Institute. How do you deal with it? I deal with it by making friends with and really cherishing the positive aspects of friends who are Islamic, and who agree with me about pluralism and freedom of speech and tolerance. But I have to recognize a basic fact, which is that back in 1933, the last time anybody got to vote on whether they liked Hitler or not, 64% of the German people voted against Adolf Hitler. And if you and I had been sitting around talking, or we'd been talking to a friend in 1933, and I had made the crazy prediction that someday Hitler was going to make a difference in Germany, and my friend would have easily told me that, what are you talking about? The German people are the most sophisticated people on the face of the planet. They are the people who gave us Goethe, Schiller, Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart. 64% of them just voted against Adolf Hitler. He looks like Charlie Chaplin. Do you think a people with this degree of sophistication is ever going to take him seriously? Do you think that with only 34% of the vote, this guy is ever going to get anywhere in Germany? And who would have been right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there is a big problem. There's a force multiplier called violence. And if you're willing to use violence, you can take a 34% vote, and you can turn it into the practical equivalent of a 68% vote. You can do it by slitting a few throats and getting a bunch of people to tremble and shit in their pants. That's what those who were in agreement with Hitler did in Japan, and Japan had a democratic government. And the militants in Japan weren't getting anywhere either. They had about a third of the country behind them, but it was only a third of the country, and they couldn't seem to get beyond that until they slit the throats of all of the men who were in the democratic government. All they had to do was slit about 4 throats in a small number of nights. Guess what? They ended up controlling the government. Hitler did the same thing with the Reichstag fire, burning down the Reichstag, the parliament, and then, of course, blaming it on Jews or somebody of the sort. Blaming it on his political enemies and using it to take absolute power in his own hands. So even if only 34% or less, if 10% of the Muslim population of the Muslim world is truly militant, that's between 120 million and 180 million people. That's more than the population of England and Germany combined. That's a lot of people. That's only 10%. And if they're willing to use violence, look what's already happening. My friends who are moderates, pluralists, and in for freedom of speech don't dare open their mouths. One of my friends who is a Muslim atheist, does he walk around his country telling people he's an atheist? Are you kidding? He'd be dead. He'd be dead, and he knows it.
Yeah, I get occasional messages from atheists in the Middle East as well.
Well, turn them on to me. I'm interested in meeting them. But the point is that we have to do our best to support those people who agree with us. We have to recognize the relative weakness of those people because of the willingness of the other side to use violence. And we have to turn the world's attention to the truly violent aspects of these things without overgeneralizing from them. Not all Islam is violent, no matter how violent. Muhammad himself, the founder of the religion, who everybody in the religion is supposed to imitate, whose footsteps everybody in Islam is supposed to follow step by step by step every day of his week, no matter how violent he was. And he ran 65 military campaigns. He commanded 65 military campaigns, and he personally led 27. And when people begged him for mercy, he often said, cut off his head. Instant death. He was a totalitarian. And anyone who tells you that Islam is just another religion like Christianity and Judaism, I'm sorry. Read the Islamic scholars. They will tell you the thing that differentiates Islam from Christianity and Judaism is that Islam is a total system of life. And it gives you a law system, it gives you a political system, it gives you a military system, it gives you even a system for wiping yourself when you go to the bathroom. In other words, it's what we would call a totalitarian system to the nth degree. And it's been that way for a very long time. And guess what? Those elements have turned out to have evolutionary staying power. How do we know? Because I've probably told you this before, but Carolyn Elkind at Harvard University, who bills herself as the leading historian, the leading scholar of imperialism in the world, told Charlie Rose with a straight face, No empire in the history of the world has ever been able to win the hearts and minds of the people it conquered. What was she talking about? Has she ever heard of Islam? Was Islam the original religion of Algeria, of northern Nigeria, of Malaysia, of Indonesia, of Pakistan? No, it conquered all of these places. Sometimes by soft conquest through trade, but most of the time through the conquest of the sword.
So I mean, I guess my original question kind of still stands. Like, what can we really do about it at this point? I mean, when they're
I suppose
what was it,
it,
1.8 million, 1.3 million, billion, 1 billion
it's
rather.
somewhere between 1.2 and 1.8, and it's probably around 1.5.
So
What
how
can
do
we
you?
do?
Yeah, how do you?
Spot the dangers and bell the cat. Spot the real negatives and bell the cat, so we don't have another situation like Hitler getting out of control and practically taking the world with him. Um, Encourage those who are genuinely tolerant and pluralistic in Islam. Do not overgeneralize to them. They're very different, very different. I mean, most of the moderate Muslims that I know have never read the Quran or have only read it briefly, and as a consequence, believe that it's a peaceful book. And as long as they believe it's a peaceful book, they will act as if it's a peaceful book, and that will be wonderful. It's not a peaceful book. It's a bloody goddamned awful book, but so is the Old Testament a bloody goddamned awful book. Thank God my parents never read it because they thought it was a peaceful book and they operated as if it was a peaceful book. And I mean, sometimes it takes violence to stop violence. Now, that doesn't mean that I mean, our violence in Iraq has turned out to be a miserable waste of human lives. Our violence in Afghanistan is turning out to be a miserable waste of human lives. Mostly a miserable waste of the lives of Iraqis and Afghans, because the number of Americans who died in these battles is so small by comparison with traditional figures on losses in wars that it's ridiculous. It's often smaller. I mean, if you take all of the American, I know this is an outrageous statement to those who've lost family members in Iran and Iraq, because the loss of one life is the loss of something infinite, which will never, ever, ever, ever return. But the fact is that the total number of people killed in the entire Americans killed in the entire Iraq war and in the entire Afghanistan war is less than the number of Americans killed on just one day in some of the battles of World War I, World War II, or the Civil War. In fact, sometimes less than the number of Americans killed in 1 hour of one battle in the American Civil War, World War I and World War II. The fact is, keep your eyes on the dangerous stuff and be fearless about pointing people to it. Do not use it to overgeneralize to the people who are peaceful within Islam. Encourage the people who are peaceful within Islam, but be willing on those occasions where it must be that way to face force with force, because at this stage in the evolution of the world, that's the best we can do. Son of fairly wealthy kids who end up making wars and revolutions and violence. So poverty is not the answer. Thwarted expectations, which is what the frustration regression hypothesis is all about. Yes, there's some validity to that. The living standard in Iran before Iran had its 1979 revolution was one of the fastest rising and highest in all of the Islamic world. Does that at all help?
Uh, it helps a little, but I wish it helped more. But
Yes, I wish I had better answers, TJ. I wish I had better answers.
I wish anyone
Um,
did. I also think it doesn't exactly help that where you stand on this issue seems to, in people's minds, automatically define a certain preset of beliefs. Like, oh, well, he's one of these people who believes this, this, and this, and this. It's like no one can have a customized belief structure anymore. Everyone has to go for one of the package deals.
well, I've explained that a little bit more because I'm thinking that out. I mean, I identify my position as being Jewish. Well, of course, that alienates a whole lot of people. Zionist, that alienates a whole lot more. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I got to tell you this story, but about 12 years ago, a bunch of friends who seemed to like my work came to the house, and I mentioned to them that I'm a Zionist. Now, one of them is the guy who, when Amy Goodman's radio show was taken off of WBAI in New York City. He helped her build a new studio and helped get her up on a satellite transponder so she could be national even without WBAI. And another one of them is one of the four leading figures in the American Communist Party. And I forget who the third one was, but so they're all way over on the left. And they said, don't you ever tell people you're a Zionist again. It's the equivalent of saying you're a Nazi, which is certainly how the Islamic lobby has been trying to portray it, the Islamic PR juggernaut. And I thought about that for 2 years and then realized, well, I better damn well tell people I'm a Zionist, because if I'm being told that it's the worst thing in the world I could say, I better identify my position. Okay, so there's a lot of people who could basically say, oh, what Bloom says is of no validity. He's one of those fucking Zionists. And then I'm telling people I'm an atheist. Well, at least I'm at home in a community of atheists here on the Amazing Atheist wavelength. But yeah, all of those things could put people off. But I don't know. I somehow feel that you're far better off letting people know where you. I don't know. There are two approaches to this. Once upon a time, when Lenin was coming up with this really sneaky as all hell way of getting people into his movement, he came up with oh God, what was it called again? The unified bloc strategy or something, the unified front or something like that. You picked a perfectly innocuous organization, or you erected an innocuous sounding organization. And meanwhile, you stayed secretly hidden in the background. And you made this united front look like it was from a huge majority of people and didn't really represent anybody with any extremist point of view. But of course, it was your cloak. It was your camouflage tactic. It was your way of putting up a big smokescreen. It was your way of looking like part of a majority when you were actually a tiny, very radical minority. And you came out from behind this unified front only once you'd gotten everybody else to shut up. And that's basically what the Dawa group in England is trying to do by presenting itself as a research group, as an impartial think tank, just like every other impartial think tank. Not that there are any really impartial think tanks, but this one has it has a very extremist message hidden behind its allegedly very mainstream perspective. And I got to admit, it's a great way to get things done. Just look how far Leninism went in Russia, and look how far it went in Europe until it was stopped. Apparently, it's a successful strategy, but I believe in the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And so I'd much rather tell you what my prejudices are so that you can judge the validity or lack of validity of my points of view. Are we talking about the same thing, or am I going off on a tangent?
No, we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah. And so you and I being atheists, and you know that that's going to get a whole bunch of people who are more believing religionists than we are against us. But I tell religionists that I'm an atheist all the time, and then they end up saying after half an hour, well, how can you say you're an atheist? You're more spiritual than just about anybody I ever met in my life. Well, hell, that's a compliment if they feel like saying that. Since they believe in spiritual stuff, and I think it's important stuff to be aware of, to know about. But I don't know. I guess I have to do my way because it's the most honest way, and hope that the most honest way is the best way to get things done. I don't know. I'm just stuck with it. I mean, in a society that believes in freedom of speech, I believe it's an obligation not to hide things.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from, the strange noises you make when you go to the bathroom, that's something that people don't need to know about. There are a few things that are irrelevant to the conversation, but even those are relevant at one point or another in life.
Yeah, I don't believe in irrelevance. I think that's the only concept I find irrelevant is the concept of irrelevance. But anyway, I guess we've been talking for about an hour and a half, so if you want to go ahead and figure out some way of trying to tie everything together into some brilliant closing
how do we try to tie everything? I don't know.
No
human
pressure,
behavior.
though.
Yes, no pressure. Now, it's all about perceptual frameworks, and every religion sets up its own perceptual framework. Every belief system that doesn't seem to have any perceptual framework at all actually has a hidden perceptual framework somewhere. The system, when we talk about the universality of human rights, we are talking about something so relative and so recent and so small and so parochial that it's just as parochial as being Jewish, Zionist, and all the rest. That doesn't mean that it's invalid. It is valid as all hell. I believe in it with all my heart and soul. I do believe that we have to advance the cause of human rights. I do believe that we have to advance the cause of freedom of speech. I do believe that we have to advance the cause of pluralism, and we have to advance the cause of tolerance. I think those should be universal human rights, but they are not built into the human condition any more than Islam is built into your bones and your cells and your tissues. And if we think that it is more important to have pluralism and tolerance than it is to have a totalitarian religion whose founder believed in killing those who protested the minute they opened their mouths in protest, or at least within 12 hours of the time they opened their mouths in protest. We better damn well know that this is not something that history is going to establish on this planet all by itself, that we are not believing something that everybody else on the planet believes in. If we sat down for a cup of coffee with people from 8 different cultures on the planet, we would have 8 different points of view, much different than ours. And it's important not to trump on other people's points of view, and it's important to champion other points of view to Islam or any other point of view that they want, so long as it doesn't hold a knife to the throat of other people's, and so long as it recognizes the rights of other peoples to exist. But when the folks on Iranian TV last week were giving the very strong impression that it was more sacrilegious to torch a bunch of pieces of paper than it was sacrilegious to torch a human life, there's something deeply disturbing there. And all of my friends who are moderate Muslims would understand exactly why that is disturbing, because their lives are regarded as worth less than a stack of printed paper, and they know it.